YouTube, what's good? This your boy Mr. Blackhorn back with another one, and guess what? I know it's been a long time since y'all probably seen my face, but you know, life and. So, and it's a good life. But yeah, so if y'all hear any background noise, I am in my kitchen with my lovely wife. She in the background, and and we cooking a little breakfast. Man, and bacon, good bacon. But anyway, so today's topic is the HEMI tick, right? So I released a short a couple of days ago, and you guys are really giving me some really good feedback. Like, I appreciate that. I know this is like an ongoing topic in the RAM community, and so this is something that I kind of wanted to get into today. So in this case, I actually found a really good video, and I think this guy on this video, which I will definitely the video will be in the description. Please go and subscribe to the video. I'm actually a little bit nervous about doing this. This is not something that I usually do, show other people's videos on my channel, but just for information's sake, like, I really feel like he, broke it down really well regarding, the HEMI tick and a lot of myths and different things like that. So he's actually a mechanic. And yeah, let's just get into it.
Hey guys, welcome back to Reignited. Now, if you don't know me, my name is Sky, and I've been a Dodge tech for over 12 years now. So I am very familiar with the HEMI product. Now, primarily my channel is HEMI based, so if that's something you're into, please consider subscribing. Now, of course, in this video, we are covering the HEMI tick, which I feel like is our first step of where we're going wrong. Why is that? Because it's titled the HEMI tick. That makes you think that there's only one HEMI tick. Now, that can be very confusing because HEMI engines, like a lot of engines, make various different ticking noises. Some of them are absolutely normal and not something to be concerned about. But when you hear that phrase, the HEMI tick, and you hear, my engine's making a ticking noise, does that mean I have the HEMI tick? There's a lot of uncertainty to that. There's a lot of concern. A lot of people are wondering, how much money is this going to cost me to fix this? So that's something I'm hoping to focus on in this video. I'm going to go over all of the different kinds of ticking noises that the HEMI engine can potentially make, and I'm going to talk about what those potential fixes are, how much it would cost to repair them, and also which ones are perfectly normal. Now, first off, I want to break down the noises that are absolutely normal to every HEMI out there. Now, I have done a lot of NVPs, new vehicle preps, and a lot of HEMI engines over the last decade or so that come through. And when you let a HEMI engine sit for a couple of days at least, and you go out and start it, it is going to rattle a little bit on initial startup. That is a little bit of lifter rattle, and that is 100% normal. There's nothing wrong. Your lifters aren't failing. They're not going to fail. That is a normal condition. If you look at the lifters themselves, they are a hydraulic lifter, which means in the back side of them, there's a little plunger that this section is filled with oil, and that provides a little bit of lash for that push rod to go up and down in. When you leave this thing sit for a couple of days, the oil tends to drain a little bit from the back side here, so you have a direct metal-to-metal contact between the push rod and the lifter. As soon as you fire up that engine, before it's able to build that oil pressure, you're going to get a little bit of that metal-to-metal rattle noise until these things pump up with oil, and then the noise goes away. Like I said, it only lasts a couple of seconds or so. Again, this is a perfectly normal condition. There is nothing to be worried about. Our next normal condition has to do with the injectors. The injectors on a HEMI engine are incredibly noisy. They are actually quite loud. All of these are an electrical solenoid that is turning on and off very quickly to supply that fuel into the engine. That plunger going up and down makes a ticking noise. These injectors, for whatever reason, are fairly loud. So when you hear your engine running, especially if you have your stock exhaust, which really quiets the engine down, you lean over the engine bay and you hear this tick, 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 tick. That's the injectors, and again, it is a perfectly normal noise. Now, this phrase inspires such fear and concern that I've even had people ask me about the ticking noise that their engine is making after they shut it off. Now, if you don't know, this is because your exhaust is cooling down, it's contracting, and it makes this tick noise. So it is very consistent, like tick tick or a ting type noise, but they're concerned. They're like, do I have the HEMI tick? I have no idea. So that's just to let you know how much fear this phrase inspires with people. But again, that is also another completely normal condition. Any engine essentially will do that after you shut it off when it's hot. You'll hear that ticking noise as that exhaust is contracting. Next up, we are going to talk about a ticking noise that is not as common, but it is something that does happen. Now, earlier we talked about that initial lifter rattle on startup that only lasts 2 or 3 seconds. Well, if you have that same rattle type noise on a cold start and it lasts for a good couple of minutes, then you could potentially have a failed lifter hydraulic portion. Now, I do have some good news about this, that it's not a catastrophic failure where essentially this plunger here is just bouncing up and down because it's no longer holding oil pressure in here properly. So you have a lot of valve lash. That's what you're hearing. You're hearing that push rod rattle up and down inside the back of this lifter. Now, the good news to that is that you're not necessarily damaging any other components when this thing goes bad. It's a pain because in order to replace it, you do have to remove the cylinder heads from the engine to get to these lifters and replace them. But largely, those are the only parts you're going to have to replace. You're going to have to replace lifters, head gaskets, and of course, because you're already in there, you want to do some valve cover gaskets, things like that. But overall, it's more of a labor-intensive type of a repair than it is a hugely financial repair. Now again, this is a somewhat rare condition. We honestly don't see failed lifters in this way all that often. Now I can hear you saying to me now, all I hear about are HEMI failed lifters. That is a different condition, and we're going to get to that here in a couple of minutes. Now, as an idea of what you can expect to pay for something like this, if you were to take this to, let's say, to a dealership to have this repaired for this issue of a failed hydraulic portion of the lifter, you're probably looking at somewhere in around the $2,000 range, which certainly isn't cheap, but it's not really crazy expensive either. Now, you would ask yourself, what can we do to actually prevent this? Well, the reality is there's nothing you can do to prevent this. This is just, it's a factory part, and at some point it could potentially fail. Like I said, it's not that common. We don't see it very often, but it does happen. And again, it is identifiable because it only happens on cold start. As soon as the vehicle builds up enough oil pressure over the course of a couple of minutes, then it will actually fill this hydraulic portion back with oil, and the noise will go away. It'll decrease that lash in there, and the noise will go away. So that's one identifier to where you could know that it was a hydraulic issue and not a lifter roller issue. Now, as far as which vehicle with the HEMI engine that this would actually affect, pretty much any of them. Basically, any engine from 2003 up to the current one could potentially have this failure. But again, it's not something that's worth thinking about or even worrying about because it is so uncommon. Now, the direct opposite to that, we're going to move straight into what I consider to be the most common HEMI tick out there. So this next HEMI tick is one that I'm sure a lot of you have already experienced. And in fact, it's one that's most often misconstrued as the one that's really, really expensive, when in fact, it's actually a fairly straightforward and much cheaper repair. I'm talking about the exhaust leaks that happen on these things. Extraordinarily common. Now, specifically what is happening? Well, on the HEMI engine, the factory exhaust manifolds are a cast steel design, whereas the cylinder heads are aluminum. This means that they will expand and contract at different rates. Also, these cast manifolds are very, very thick, which means they hold a lot of heat, which means when you go through enough heat cycles, they will eventually warp a little bit. What happens is this causes these rear studs to break, or I've seen sometimes the front ones will break as well, but most often it's these rear studs will break, and then you develop an exhaust leak at the back of the manifold. So this noise is very prominent on cold start, and then as the cylinder head heats up and as the exhaust manifold heats up, they contract, they both expand and expand to where there's no more gap, so you lose that exhaust leak, so the tick noise is no longer present. Again, it's very loud, very noticeable, and that's something that I find that most often people think, oh no, I've got the HEMI tick, when the reality is you've just got an exhaust leak, and it's actually a pretty simple repair to pull these manifolds off and replace them. I actually have an entire video about it, if you want to check it out right here, that shows the entire repair process. Now, if you were to take this to a dealer per side, you'd probably be looking at about $500 to repair it, which of course still isn't cheap, but it's a lot cheaper than the next HEMI tick. Now, I do have some good news about this particular form of the HEMI tick, and that is that it is actually really simple to diagnose, even with someone with no mechanical experience whatsoever. So, if you take a look here at the exhaust manifold, you'll notice that it has this heat shield bolted to the outside of the manifold. This heat shield is bolted using those studs at the rear and front of the exhaust manifold, and those are the bolts that break. So all you have to do is, when the vehicle is cold, go out and access these heat shields, reach down there with your fingers and pull on that heat shield a little bit. If it feels nice and tight and there's little to no movement, you know that that's not your problem. But generally, if you reach towards the back of these heat shields and you pull on it and it moves a good half an inch or so, pretty clear that you have some broken studs back there. Now, some vehicles, these heat shields are going to be easier to access than others. The 1500s and 2500s are by far the easiest. In fact, because you can just reach through the fender well, through the splash shield, and actually get right to the heat shield. So you can literally do this without even opening the hood on your vehicle. Such a simple process. Now, the cars, on the other hand, it can be a much more difficult process because the engine is tucked pretty tightly in there. So to reach your hand down in there to actually get to those heat shields can be a little bit more difficult, but definitely not impossible. The Grand Cherokees, the Commanders, much the same situation. It's very tight and there is no fender well access on those vehicles. It's actually a solid bulkhead there, so you can't actually reach through it all, which is kind of unfortunate. But if you can slide your hands down the side of the valve cover here and just reach down to where those heat shields are, and again, my recommendation would be do so at the rear of the manifold itself, because those are by far the most common to break. So give yourself the most leverage you can by reaching to the rear of that heat shield and just tug on it a little bit. You don't yanking on it as hard as you can. Just tug on it a little bit. You'll very easily feel if it has too much movement or not. Now, I talked about how one of the issues with these cast manifolds is how thick they are and how much heat that they retain. Well, I brought in a Ram 1500 manifold here, and these are the same for the 2500s as well. But I just wanted to show you exactly how thick these things are. It's really a bit ridiculous when you think about it. I mean, look at that. This thing is just a beast. So you can certainly imagine how much heat these things retain. So they go through enough of those heat cycles, and it's not entirely surprising that they will break those bolts, especially when you think about the fact that with as thick as these flanges are, those bolts are fairly decently sized on there. So you have that long length compounded by these dissimilar metals, compounded by this really thick flange that holds a ton of heat. Yeah, somewhat inevitable. Now, what can you do to prevent this issue? Well, a lot of people will just say, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this factory hardware and upgrade it to some aftermarket hardware, and then that seems to fix the problem, because generally around every 30,000 miles is when you'll see these studs break. It's worse in the Ram trucks. I'm not exactly sure why. The Grand Cherokees, the Challengers, Chargers, they will still do it, but not to the scale that the Ram trucks will do it. The trucks, for whatever reason, are very susceptible to this. I'm not sure if it has something to do with their manifold design or what exactly the case is, but we see it probably 3-to-1 trucks to car ratio. Now, another option that many people have decided to do is they've decided to swap to a set of shorty headers, some aftermarket headers, and the difference there is that you have a much thinner flange on the header. The tubes themselves, the pipes, are a much thinner wall, and all of that together means that it does not retain heat like these cast manifolds do, so you don't get quite the expansion and contraction of the factory manifolds. Also, you're upgrading to a different hardware anyway when you're putting headers on there, so it seems to alleviate the issue. And there's several shorty headers on the market that will bolt directly up to your factory exhaust. So honestly, if you're gonna pay $500 per side to fix it, almost kind of makes sense financially to upgrade to the set of headers while you're there. Now, as far as what range of HEMI vehicles does this affect, I would say as far back as 2005 is when I've seen them, and then all the way up through, I would say about through 2019. I have not seen if any of the 2020 and up trucks are having this issue. I don't know if it's just they haven't had enough mileage on them yet to be sure, or they might have changed the exhaust manifolds or the hardware themselves. I'm not sure, but I know at least through 2019, especially if you have a Ram truck, you're probably looking at going to be doing these about every 30,000 miles or so. Now, as an alternative solution when you're repairing this issue, Chrysler does offer upgraded hardware to keep this from happening again. Problem is, it's fairly expensive, and a lot of people opt for just the standard hardware because they don't want to pay the extra money. Now, as I'm sure you can tell from what I'm talking about, there's not a lot you can do in the way of preventative maintenance other than swapping the hardware before it actually happens. And now we come to the big dog, the one that is most commonly known as the HEMI tick. This is the big boy. This is the one that is going to cost the most money. Now, what are we talking about specifically? We are talking about cam and lifter failure. So essentially, whether it's the cam that is failing or the lifter that is failing first, it's a chicken or the egg scenario. It really doesn't matter. You're ended up having to replace them both. But essentially, the needle roller bearings in your lifters are failing and flopping up and down, and that is, after that happens, then they start to eat into the cam lobe itself. Now it continues to do this more and more until that cam lobe becomes more flat and less pointy, and this means it'll start to misfire on that cylinder. That's usually about the time people start to notice it. Why aren't they noticing it before? It is a HEMI tick, right? But here is the difference, and this is a great identifier of if you have this particular HEMI tick. This HEMI tick is not present on cold start. This is a tick noise that you will only notice after the vehicle is completely at operating temperature and at idle. You can hear a very soft tick noise. Generally, if it's really bad, you'll hear a harder tick, but generally, if it is initially going bad, you'll hear a soft tick. I think it almost sounds like a ping pong ball bouncing around inside the engine because it's almost an irregular noise as well. It's not a consistent ting, ting, ting noise. It's more of like a ting, 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 ting. I know it's a great reproduction of it, but essentially that's how you can tell if you're dealing with a lifter issue versus all of these other tick noises. Again, the vehicle has to be at operating temperature and it has to be at idle, because as soon as you come off of idle and start revving the engine up, the noise will go away. And so you're thinking, well, I don't really think I have a problem because the noise goes away. Well, that's not true. It's just the harmonics of the engine change, so you can't actually hear it anymore, even though it's still actually happening. Now, what is this going to cost to fix? That is the real big question here. I've been telling people for a long time that if you go to a dealership to have this done, you're probably looking at around $4,500 to get this job done. Definitely not a cheap thing to take care of. So that's why people are so freaked out about it, because of the cost involved. But again, it's only this one specific issue that's going to cost that kind of money to fix it. The other issues are much simpler and don't cost nearly as much. So what exactly is involved in the repair of this particular issue? Well, this is the big one. You're still going to have to remove those cylinder heads to replace those lifters in there. And also you're going to have to remove the timing cover to take the camshaft out and replace that. And I'm speaking specifically in the case of the 6.4 liter in the truck engines only. If that cam lobe has been worn down enough and enough of that metal has gotten down inside there, Chrysler will not warranty it unless you replace the entire engine at that point, because they have a special auxiliary engine oil cooler, and that metal debris gets caught inside that cooler and it'll actually go right through the engine. So if you just put a camshaft and lifters in the 6.4 truck engines, a lot of times that metal will find its way back into the engine and it'll ruin it after you've done that replacement. So again, Chrysler says, nope, at that point you've got to put a whole new engine in there, which, man, that's really, then the cost kind of really starts going through the roof. So the 6.4 truck engines, that's a bit tougher of a situation. Now, how do you know how much metal has gone through the engine to make that decision? Well, I have some good news for you. This is actually fairly simple. What you do is you have to remove the intake manifold, and on the back side of the timing cover in the engine valley, there's a solenoid there. That solenoid is the VVT solenoid, or variable valve timing solenoid. What you do, there's a single 10mm bolt that holds that solenoid in place. You remove that solenoid and then look at the metal screen. If there's a bunch of metal on that screen, you're going to be buying an engine. However, if the screen is pretty much clear of metal debris, you can get away with just replacing the camshaft and lifters. Now, this is a good strategy to do on the 5.7 engines as well, but especially the 6.4 truck engines. Now, the question everyone is looking for the answer to: how can I prevent this from happening? Well, I can talk to you a little bit about some of the issues that actually seem to make the problem worse, and one of those is very poor oil changes. I see this quite a bit. People like to go 10,000 miles between oil changes. Don't do it. It's a poor decision. The oil seems to break down faster than that, and I personally would not go any longer than 5,000 miles between my oil changes. Even with full synthetic, I'm just not that comfortable with it, and I want to make sure that that oil is not a limiting factor within the engine. Now, the next major factor is idle time, high idle time specifically. And I'm not talking about if you idle your vehicle for 15 minutes here and 20 minutes there. No, I'm talking about you're idling it for in excess of an hour a day. That seems to really affect things. So on fleet vehicles, specifically police vehicles that have really high idle times, we generally see an almost 100% failure rate with their lifters in those situations, because you have a combination of factors. One, you have super high idle times, and then because they're not actually driving the vehicle, they're just running the vehicle, they're not changing their oil for a very, very long time until the mileage says that they should replace it. However, Chrysler has released some specific information, especially for fleet vehicles, that advises them to change that oil based off of engine hours rather than mileage if you're going to be idling your vehicle a lot. So that's a big factor there as well.
So there you have it, guys. I mean, it was, you know, that video, that guy really broke it down. I feel like, you know, as a Ram owner, he really gave a lot of good insight. Really the portions where he talked about there's not one specific HEMI tick, but he kind of went through all of the different, you know, sounds or what you may think would be the HEMI tick. So it was very informational. Definitely helped me out a lot, and you know, I now have a few options of things I want to look at. So you guys let me know what you think about the video. You know, again, would love to hear your comments, your experiences with your Rams. And yeah, let us all know, you know, let's talk about this thing a little bit more in depth. Do you agree with what he said? Are there certain things that you disagree with? Let us know in the comments. All right, guys, until the next video, you guys take it easy. We'll see you soon. Peace.